Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. If you're one of the 30 million fans in 40 countries around the world of now legendary attorneys Rusty Sabich and Sandy Stern, first made famous in bestsellers like Presumed Innocent, also a blockbuster film starring Harrison Ford, or its sequels The Burden of Proof, Pleading Guilty, Personal Injuries, Innocent, and most recently The Last Trial, you'll want to join us today as we're speaking with the creator, the one and only Scott Turow. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you on the show. Long before you became a household name yourself, what were some of the early books you grew up reading as a kid?
A lot of books in my house. My grandmother brought my mother up to be a reader. My grandmother read in three languages. She read in Yiddish, in Russian, and in English. And she was always reading. She always had a book in her hand. In fact, in one of my favorite stories about her, she was with us. My grandparents spent a lot of time in our house. And, she was a typical immigrant lady. She always had a sweater on in the air conditioning. And she had decided, because she couldn't find a translation that would be easier for her, to read Moby Dick. And eventually, my best friend, who was always in the house and saw her regularly, finally said to her, says, "Mrs. Pastron, you've been reading that book all summer. What is this book Moby Dick about?" And she thought for a second. She says, "A fish. That's about a fish." So, but the idea of somebody reading Moby Dick in their third language will probably give a clue as to the kind of dedication to books that I grew up with. My mom's aspiration, which she achieved never at the level that she hoped, was to be an author. She read a lot. She was, I guess in retrospect, I'd call her a kind of middlebrow reader. She thought James Michener was the great American novelist of her time, which probably had more merit than intellectuals in those days would be inclined to give her. But she was always reading, and I was the kind of kid who, because I don't think I'm quite ADD, but I'm very dreamy, and I hated the discipline of being in school. So, and I had bad tonsils anyway, but I was always inclined to claim that I was sick. And eventually my mom, rather than engage in the kind of, figurative hand-to-hand combat that is required to get your reluctant kid to go to school, said, "Fine, you can stay home, but you have to read something. You can't just lay there and, wait for the time that I'll let you watch television." And one of the books that just really sort of changed my life that she made me read — she was a former French major — was The Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas. And that was a transformative experience for me. I was about 10 years old. And I could not wait to get back to that book. I remember, just rushing through meals so I could crawl back in bed to keep reading The Count of Monte Cristo. And eventually the thought occurred to me, if it is this exciting to read this book, how much even more exciting must it have been to write that book? And it was at that point that the experience of being a reader first transformed itself in my mind into the thought of becoming a writer.
When do you first remember making up your own original stories as a child?
I was a very dreamy kid, so I don't think I lied a lot. I may be wrong about that. But and I tried my first shot at writing a novel when I was 11, which was almost entirely plagiarized from something else that I'd read in school. But it was a long time, Jake, before I learned to harness my wandering imagination in a way that was productive in literary terms.
Did you have any significant mentors in high school or college that first helped you find your voice as an author?
Of course, the answer is yes. Nobody gets where they are on their own. Nobody sort of catapults themselves into success, no matter what some people like to think. Uh, and I had great high school English teachers. A guy named Stephen Bach, who went on to be quite well known in his own right as an author, wrote books about Hollywood. He was very interested in film, eventually moved to Paris. A guy named Bob Boyle, who was the advisor for the newspaper, who kept a good eye on me and my writing. And when I got to college, it was a little more of a struggle because, as I often say, I can explain just how much my head was in the clouds by saying that, I went to a small men's college in Massachusetts, Amherst College. And it was a shock to me when I got there that I hadn't bothered to notice that there were no creative writing courses. So, I had to settle at that point for taking English classes. A lot of good teachers, though, as it happens. David Sofield, who is a noted poet in his own right, the great Americanist, Leo Marx. The transformative experience I had in college was working with Tilly Olson, who was a American icon in shorter fiction. And, she's just a remarkable writer who really made me understand the preciousness of every word that gets recorded on the page. And, I learned a huge amount from Tilly, but the most important thing, to be honest, was the confidence that she had in me as a writer. And she once inscribed one of her copies of her book, books, and the inscription was something like, Scott, descendant and successor in the generations of writers. That was just incredible confirmation for me. And so, then on that platform, I started publishing short stories while I was still in college. And as you mentioned, ended up as a creative writing fellow at Stanford, where I ended up spending 5 years, 2 as a fellow and then 3 as a teacher.
What do you feel like you took away from your fellowship at the Creative Writing Center at Stanford that maybe stuck with you throughout your career?
The Stegner program, as it's called, named after the great American 20th century writer, Wallace Stegner, who for many years headed that program, was founded when Wally, who had been a teacher at Harvard, was lured away to come to Stanford. And the chairman of the English department, a guy named Jones, had a brother in Texas who was, a very rich oilionaire, as they used to say. And Wally sort of sweet talked him out of the money to start this writing program. And Wally's idea was that, we would, he would have enough money that every year he'd be able to give a small stipend to a number of young writers, some poets, some writers of fiction, and that they would be sort of the backbone of this program. And he had a good nose for news. I mean, the first class that came in included Larry McMurtry, who was, of course, the writer of Lonesome Dove and zillions of other books that are very, very well remembered. In terms of endearment, I could, the Last Little Picture Show in Texas. I mean, tons of really good books. So the program got off to a great start, and it's still the case that many gifted young American writers pass through that program as fellows for a couple of years. When I got struck by lightning many years later, when Presumed Innocent was published, I made it a point to endow another writing fellowship at Stanford so that people to come would be able to enjoy some of the good fortune that I had had in those years. What did I learn? I learned a lot in a lot of different ways. I, first of all, was surrounded by an incredible number of talented young writers, which was instructive in its own way, because for whatever you're into, whether it's music or, the graphic arts or whatever it is, it's an audacious thing to say, I want to be an artist, a writer, a composer. And so being surrounded by other people who had the same aspiration was extremely, it was supportive. Here were other people who had the guts to say the same thing. And I learned a lot from them. I learned good things and I learned bad things. I saw, frankly, some of the self-destructive tendencies that are not unknown to people in the arts, and some of them overcame them, some of them didn't. I watched people throw away their talent, and in other cases, like Ray Carver's, ultimately harness their demons and leave behind a greatly admired body of work. In terms of the more practical things, Wallace Stegner, whom I mentioned, still revered. One of my law partners was on the phone the other day, badgering me about Stegner, because he was a great admirer of his. But Wally taught a lot of really wonderful, subtle things. But the irony is that what I most remember are some of the simplest things he taught. Namely, you cannot be a novelist without treating it as a job. And you have to do it every day. And as Dick Scowcroft, who was Wally's second in command and my favorite teacher at Stanford, as Dick liked to say, the muse may not visit every day, but you have to give her a chance to show up. And if you're not sitting in a chair with your hands on your keyboard or your typewriter, that wasn't going to happen. And Wally was very, very frank about the methodical nature of being a novelist. He said that he wrote 2 pages every day, except Christmas, on the theory that at the end of the year, he would have 730 pages. And in 730 pages, there had to be something worth saving. So I, as I said, I was his great admirer. He became a true friend to me, for which I was enormously grateful. And but it was the simple lessons that really stuck out. And he was in his willingness to say that being an author is a job. He was basically giving the back of his hand to sort of all the avant-garde mystery about being a writer, and crediting the amount to which hard work, as well as inspiration, will matter. And those were lessons, of course, I always took to heart.
With 1L, the turbulent true story of a first year at Harvard Law School, you were actually in law school when you wrote this book, correct?
It's a long, kind of amusing story. So I'm at Stanford, as I said, a writing fellow. Then I was a teacher in the creative writing program for 3 years. which you can imagine being a teacher at Stanford's a great platform if you want to go on with your academic career. And so that became sort of the natural direction I thought I was going. And fortunately for me, I looked up after I'd begun to interview for academic jobs and I got some nice offers and asked myself the question that everybody ought to, namely, is this really what I want to be doing? Is this what I want to do with the rest of my life? And when I was honest with myself, the answer was no. It was not what I wanted to do. And so then the question was, well, if I don't want to do that, what do I want to do? Since it went without saying that I was not going to, I was not going to be able to support myself writing fiction at that point. I could paper my walls with rejection slips. So, and I had all kinds of options. You know, I could have gone to Hollywood and gotten a studio job as they used to exist in those days, because my ex-wife had a relative who was in that field with whom I always got along, and thought about going into advertising. That just struck me as death. And I realized that leaving aside the writers, the other coterie of friends I had were all lawyers. And, you know, and I thought what they were doing was just incredibly interesting. I knew nothing about what lawyers did. My father hated lawyers. There were never any lawyers allowed to visit our house. So when my friends became attorneys, it was really revelatory to me. And I thought, wow, this is really neat. These are the kinds of questions I am really interested in. And so despite having what I knew many of my friends in the English department would regard as the job offer of a lifetime, in a university in the East, I said, I want to be a lawyer. I'm going to go to law school. And well, at that point, then I had to explain that decision to the literary agent that I had at that time, who had been an incredible good sport about trying to sell the novel that I had written in my years at Stanford, which was not bad in fairness to myself, but just not timely anymore by the time I finished it. It was sort of a hippie novel when America was sick of hippies. So I felt really guilty about having to tell her that I was going to law school. And I literally got in the middle of this letter to her. And I said, but you know, what would be a good idea is if someone were to write a book about being a first-year law student, because there's no nonfiction book out there like that. And they're books by professors telling students, you know, how they ought to study and how they ought to feel about the law. You know, John J. Osborne had written The Paper Chase by then. But there wasn't a nonfiction book talking about the nuts and bolts of a law student's life. And so I kind of lobbed this to her, and I wasn't really proposing that I write the book. I was just sort of trying to give her what I thought would be a good idea that might lead her to forgive me for having deserted writing as my first calling. Even though I always said, I'm not going to quit. I'm going to do this as I can at the margins. And I was shocked then. I got a letter back from her. And usually she would send me a real thin envelope with a little tiny cover letter and a rejection letter on my novel enclosed. This was thick. And I opened it up. I'm standing on the stairs of the apartment I was then living in San Francisco. And there's a contract to write this book about being a first-year law student, this book that I hadn't quite actually proposed to write. And, you know, for the first time in my life, I was about 24 then, I really understood what irony meant. Because here I was, I had sort of turned away, not turned my back on, but at least turned away from a literary career, going to law school, and boom, now I have a contract to write a book. And as I like to say, going to law school was the great break of my literary career in many, many ways, because I had really taken my own mark well. And I was truly interested in the law, and interested in a way that sort of, pulled at my heart and my guts. And um, that, of course, as it turned out, was to be my subject. And 1L, I signed the contract. I have no idea how I was going to be able to write this book. I worked feverishly as a first-year law student, and then also wrote this book at nights and on the weekends. And then in the 14 weeks between the first and second year, finished it and sent it off to New York. Not completely sure how the editor who commissioned the book would respond to it. But, another long comic story, but well, I may as well tell it. I sent the book to Ned Chase, who was the editor who bought the book. And Ned's was a kind of wacky guy, Chevy Chase's father, as it happens. And I sent the book, and I didn't hear anything from him. And finally, my phone rang, and it was Ned, and he says, I need to talk to you about something. And I said, oh, you don't like the way it's written. Oh, the writing is fine. You don't like the way it's typed, because there was a broken key on my typewriter. No, we can read the damn thing. And I need you to remind me. He said, why did I ever want to buy this book? And so having written the book, I then had to sell it back to Ned. And I told him how there was this booming American interest in the law, and which, I mean, I don't know if I'd noticed it before that moment when I had to say that as a point of salesmanship. But booming American interest in the law, and law school applications had quadrupled in the wake of Watergate. And I did enough of a sales pitch, since he'd already paid me for most of it, that he said, oh yeah, okay, I'll publish the book. But people always wonder, how could you write a nonfiction book, albeit with the names changed, about your classmates and professors while you're still a student at Harvard Law School? And the answer is simple. After I had that first conversation with Ned, I was terrified that if I asked him to wait another year to publish the book, he would forget again why he wanted to publish it. And this time he might not be so easily persuaded to do it. And so, I had to go forward, even though it ended up making for a very, very uncomfortable third year.
That's brave. Were you worried what your fellow students or professors would think when the book came out?
My closest friends knew what I was doing. And for the most part, they were very forgiving, even though I think it goes without saying that they didn't always agree 100% with the way they were portrayed. But they'd known what was going on, and I remained their friend, and they could accept it. They were, for the most part, very gracious. One guy was a little pissed off, but I made up with him over the years. But on the other hand, the people with whom I wasn't close were less accepting. And it tells you everything you need to know about Harvard Law School that I was standing in the student union, the Harkness Commons, when the New York Times published, which was a great review of 1L. And I'm watching these two guys. I know them both a little vaguely, but not very well, just on sight mostly in there. And one of them's reading this great review and saying, I should have done that. As if the 5 years that I'd spent at Stanford, the years I'd spent at Amherst writing, as if that meant nothing. I mean, they're at Harvard Law School, they can do anything. And so I'm, sitting there thinking to myself, well, fuck you too. Anyway, and then, there were people like some of my professors, really only one of them, who was deeply offended. And I realized I was kind of a marked man on campus. But I survived it. It was a life governed by good breaks.
Your first time seeing that book on sale in the Harvard Law School bookstore must have been a trip.
In those years when I was writing and aspiring and wishing and hoping, I would think, God, if I could just hold in my hands a book that I'd written, I would have really felt that my life would be complete. And, years later, of course, when I held my first child, um, I, I knew what that really would feel like, to feel your life was complete. But as a second best, holding 1L did pretty well. The irony, of course, when you're writing a book in particular, and you know this, Jake, it goes through so many stages that it sort of sneaks up on you. So first there's a manuscript, and then there's copy editing, and then you finally see it in type, and then you're holding, a galley, and then you're holding a hardcover book. So it's not quite as dramatic as I, in my naivete, had imagined. It wasn't just one big step, but it was still thrilling.
You were actually working as a U.S. attorney while you were writing Presumed Innocent, correct?
I had never renounced my ambition to be a novelist. And, I had promised myself that somehow I was going to still have the time to write fiction, which turned out to be on the morning commuter train. It was really the only time I had. But I would write, bearing in mind what Wally Stegner and Dick Scowcroft had taught me. 30 minutes a day on the morning commuter train, I would write longhand at first, in spiral notebooks. And, I think there were some books left over, frankly, notebooks left over from my days in law school. As I've been continued to be a dreamy student and hadn't really taken notes. So, but as I began to think about being a novelist and being a lawyer, I started to learn some really, really good lessons. And while I was at Stanford, there were a lot of highfalutin debates about literary theory and what's the goal of fiction, and what makes great work. And the two competing visions were sort of the Tolstoyan one. On one hand, there's the avant-gardists who think that art leads culture, and therefore the greatest art is the art it's almost like technology. It's the new thing. Then there was the Tolstoyan view. Let me go back one more step. The avant-gardists said, and Ezra Pound being the best example of the attitude that always struck me funny, which was, the artist is the antenna of the race, and thus he will never be understood by the bullet-headed many. So this presupposes that art is an elite exercise. And the greatest art can't be understood by most people. Then there's Tolstoy, who says the idea that, that great art can't be understood by most people is like saying that, great food tastes bad to almost everyone. He just dismissed that out of hand. And it went without saying that as an artist, I like the poems of Ezra Pound, but Tolstoy's, number one for me. But how to write a book that could be understood by the many was not as obvious to me. And I remember sitting in a courtroom trying to figure this out, as I did almost every day, and of course attending to my duties as a lawyer. And I was watching two younger lawyers do their stuff another story, since I end up remembering everything. But case ended up going all the way to the US Supreme Court because of a jury instruction. But I'm sitting there watching, and I'm looking around, and what was the case about? Stolen food stamps. The name was Liparata, of the defendant. And yet, it's a piddling crime, right? But Everybody in the courtroom is just spellbound when the star witness got on the stage and, talked about how Frank Liberata had hatched this plot, to steal and cash food stamps. And I thought, wow, look at this. Here's a universal subject, crime. Everybody's fascinated by crime. And even if it's not everybody, I'm fascinated by crime. What had drawn me most during those years at Stanford when I was saying, gosh, what these lawyers do is fascinating. What had drawn me most were my friends who had become prosecutors or, in a couple of cases, defense lawyers. I didn't care which side they were on, but just that clash about, how you define good versus evil. And, how do you cabin the power of the state so that they're not just imprisoning people willy-nilly. That just all spoke to me. And so, when I got a chance while I was a law student at Harvard, because the law school campus was a little hostile, I went off to the Boston DA's office and worked there as a clerk, and eventually was allowed to try a couple of very, very minor cases, one involving a guy who owned too many dogs and didn't have a kennel permit. But I loved it. I loved it. I loved the criminal law. And in that courtroom, watching Liberata, which, as I say, how ironic, the only case I was involved in I guess 35 years was that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, was this sort of rum-dum food stamps case. And I had told the two young women who were working for me, oh no, he's given the wrong jury instruction. We're going to have trouble with that. And I was right. It went all the way to the Supreme Court on that basis. But aside from recognizing the jury instruction was a problem, I just realized this is it. This is the heartland. And I really committed myself then to writing a novel that I had already started, which was based loosely on my experiences in the Suffolk County, the Boston DA's office.
Readers got to know Kindle County really well in Presumed Innocent and in many books that followed. Is that actually based on a place you lived in or worked in before?
I was writing, I thought about Boston, but I was working feverishly as an AUSA. It's a wonderful job, but it's not an easy lift. So I was working truly, 60 to 70 hours a week. And I never have really kept a diary or a journal. Everything that's really that leaps out to me as having emotional significance, I end up plucking and putting into the novel. So I'm writing about Boston, but as the years went on, the place I was writing about began to resemble Chicago more and more. And eventually I faced the fact, well, this isn't Chicago and this isn't Boston. So, it's a smaller Midwestern city, more like the size of Milwaukee than Chicago. But it's not Milwaukee either. So I just have to give it another name. And somehow Kindle County came up. There is a Kendall County in the far outskirts of the Chicago metropolitan area. So that probably was working under the surface. But I was writing, I thought about Boston, but I was working feverishly as an AUSA. It's a wonderful job, but it's not an easy lift. So I was working truly, 60 to 70 hours a week. And I never have really kept a diary or a journal. Everything that's really that leaps out to me as having emotional significance, I end up plucking and putting into the novel. So I'm writing about Boston, but as the years went on, the place I was writing about began to resemble Chicago more and more. And eventually I faced the fact, well, this isn't Chicago and this isn't Boston. So, it's a smaller Midwestern city, more like the size of Milwaukee than Chicago. But it's not Milwaukee either. So I just have to give it another name. And somehow Kindle County came up. There is a Kendall County in the far outskirts of the Chicago metropolitan area. So that probably was, was working under the surface, but I just.
No, it's great. Go ahead. I apologize.
No, somehow it was Kindle County. And, I've been spending time with friends in Minneapolis, and I was impressed that, like Hennepin County was in some ways the more important governmental unit, that there were places in the US where county level governance mattered, particularly when there was more than one municipality. So, and I just decided, okay, it's Kindle County. There are 3 cities there, 3 small cities, and Kindle County is really the umbrella over all of them. And the license, of course, to invent a whole new landscape and a whole new history was and has been wonderful over the years.
America first fell in love with attorneys Rusty Sabich and Sandy Stern, and the book and blockbuster film that followed. Take fans back to the first time those 2 characters knocked on the door to your muse.
They all had attributes of people I knew, but most often, something from this person, something from that person. Rusty has a more direct antecedent. In the Suffolk County DA's office, the Boston DA's office, I had worked for and been supervised by a wonderful man, a terrific lawyer who, not shockingly, went on to great success as a trial lawyer in private practice, a guy named Tim O'Neill. And Tim fascinated me because he was a great prosecutor, and tough in the way prosecutors have to be, but he was, Irish by birth, and he was also a poet. And he read his poems at times at a Cambridge bar called The Plough and the Stars. And I just got this idea, wow, what if I wrote a mystery novel, but instead of the sort of hard-boiled, diction of Raymond Chandler, which is in some ways, Hemingway-esque in the sense that it doesn't describe a lot of emotion. It's all implied. Instead of doing the hard-boiled version, what if it was more poetic? What if the voice sounded more literary? And that really was inspired by Tim. And Tim was in a difficult position in those years because Garrett Byrne, the very elderly district attorney in Boston, was dealing with an insurgent in his office named Newman Flanagan. And Flanagan was, kind of a born demagogue. And he'd prosecuted a Black obstetrician gynecologist named Kenneth Edelin, who died a couple of years ago. He'd prosecuted him for murder because he had performed a late-term abortion. It wasn't really any question what Edelin had done was legal, but of course, Newman Flanagan was smart enough to know that this was something that would attract support from the numerous very religious Catholics in the Boston area. And so he really stood on the throat, to use a familiar image these days, of a very fine physician in order to propel his own political career. And so that became the sort of emotional and in some ways factual backdrop of Presumed Innocent. And, Tim, who really was the person who should have run for DA if Garrett Byrne was going to step down, he was the guy who everybody in the office would have supported. Tim was too loyal to do that. to try to push the old man out of the way. And just as in Presumed Innocent, just as Nico Della Guardia wins the election, Newman Flanagan won the election and became the new DA. Described, writing on the morning commuter train, and I don't have any damn idea exactly where this book is going once I get beyond the Newman Flanagan stuff and the idea of this very talented chief deputy in the office who's sort of cornered because he's too loyal to try to replace his boss. But eventually, the idea became he's investigating a murder, and lo and behold, he, the prosecutor, ends up accused of the murder. And that seemed kind of daring. But once I accepted the fact that he was going to end up on trial, which ironically, that developed because my agent, this crusty old lady, called me up and after 1L, and I'd been working as a AUSA for a couple of years. I told her what I was doing, and she interrupted. She says, wow, there's a trial in that book, isn't there? And frankly, because I was always too afraid of her to contradict her, I said yes. And that really was the birth of the idea that Rusty was going to get accused. So once he gets accused, of course, he has to have a defense lawyer. And I was a third of the way into the book, at least conceptually. And I'd never even thought of now, defense lawyer. This is a character who really appears 40% of the way through the book, which is a weird time for a major character to suddenly drop into the scene. But that's exactly what happens with Sandy. And, I wanted him to be different. I didn't want him to be, the slick talking, criminal defense lawyer, in their cheap shoes and cheap suits and long hair that I would see in the courthouse. I wanted him to be, the very gentlemanly defense lawyers who were more of a rarity, but much, much more effective in federal court. And as a sort of idea of a gentleman, I'd always been fascinated by a friend of my parents who was a Cuban expat. And he was, to describe as Stern is described in one of the later books, he was kind of a dumpy looking little guy. But when this man began to speak, and he was not a lawyer, he just exuded charm. He became charismatic. And it was, as subsequently was said about Sandy, it was as if a beacon had lit up inside him. And so I exported this friend of my parents, figuratively speaking, to the courtroom, since I thought, well, that kind of guy could end up being a very effective lawyer. Because juries like people who are somewhat humble looking, so that, they don't feel they're looked down upon. They feel like they can identify with them. Sandy Stern, as a lawyer, is able to take advantage of everything that somebody else might perceive as a deficit.
The judge in that book was a piece of work. Was he actually based on any judges you appeared before as a U.S. attorney?
By the time I got to the end of writing Presumed Innocent, I'd been an AUSA for quite a while.
Yeah.
And I'd seen a lot of judges. There were a couple of African-American judges I was familiar with. Ironically, not in the federal court. The second half of my career as an assistant U.S. attorney was spent investigating corrupt lawyers, including corrupt judges. And, I had gotten to know and see a couple of African-American lawyers and judges who were deeply impressive to me, albeit in a really complex way. And I couldn't probably articulate it at that time in the way I would now, which is to say they came up in a world where the bigotry was so prevalent that the only way that they were going to get ahead was to cut some corners now and then. Uh, and and I remember going to talk to one of these judges when I was about to try my biggest case. And he was just a great trial lawyer. I had seen him he'd done an exhibition while I was in law school. And I greatly admired him. And, there were some questions about Gene's background. And if I had to guess, like I said, I think he's probably cut some corners. But, I accepted then, as I accept now, that, people couldn't be the prisoners of prejudice. And if that's what they had to do, that's what they had to do. But he in particular, who was an overwhelming presence in the courtroom, he contributed a lot to Laren Little.
With the sequels, Burden of Proof and Pleading Guilty, how much fun was it to bring those characters back to life on the page?
Well, the genesis of Pleading Guilty, which was the third novel. The second novel was Burden of Proof, which was about Sandy Stern, who really, in my mind, became the character who ran away with the book and presumed innocent. So my next book, I had really wanted to write a book about, all the crazy shit that had been going on when I was at Stanford with, these revolutionaries and shootings across the quad and professors who were, alleged, and I'm pretty well convinced, were correctly accused of being involved in murders. And but that book about the 60s, which I ultimately finished, called The Laws of Our Fathers, was that was a slog. It was really hard to get my arms around what was involved. And I stopped at one point. I just kind of threw up my hands and said, okay, well, I'm going to write something easier about a kind of wise guy lawyer who's been, kind of a failure in the practice of law, and is being kept around by his partners, mostly because he's a former cop and knows the ins and outs of the way things work in the city. And that became Pleading Guilty. And, I always think of Pleading Guilty as a comic novel. I was concerned when I wrote it that it would seem too far afield from the books beforehand. And I remember my Italian editor, Giancarlo Boncina, my agent sent him the manuscript. He was a great reader. And he says, does this seem too weird for Scott? And he couldn't even understand the question. To him, it was about lawyers. It was about legal intrigue. It was like, how is this not Scott? So, but yeah, I enjoyed inhabiting the prickly skin of Matt Malloy and his wise guy voice.
It must have felt like a whirlwind right on the heels of Harrison Ford playing Rusty Sabich in Presumed Innocent to have Burden of Proof get turned into a TV miniseries.
Bear in mind that Presumed Innocent was written on the morning commuter train, and then when I had bought the first of the personal computers, with the indulgence of my ex-wife, which I always acknowledge, and if I didn't, she would remind me anyway. But I mean, that's a book written on the train and in the basement, and all of a sudden, the biggest movie star in Hollywood is playing the lead, and that's somewhat hallucinatory to have that experience. I've always had a somewhat happy attitude toward the movies, though. A lot of people are utterly beguiled by what is clearly the dominant narrative form now in our culture, with incredible gravitational force on not only the American audience, but on the audiences around the world. And somehow I was smart enough to know, look, I know a lot about writing fiction. I've thought about this really hard. But just because I've watched a bunch of movies in my life does not make me a filmmaker. And and I had an uncle who grew up in Chicago but went to LA, um, and I visited him a lot in West LA, and I knew I knew the good and the bad of LA, including the atmosphere of bullshit that surrounds the world of Hollywood, and just didn't feel like it was where I belonged. So I've always been able to hold that whole process at a great distance. And ironically, in the last 10 years, I have begun writing more for Hollywood. I've written several pilot scripts by now, and gotten paid well, but nothing's gotten into production. Pleading guilty ultimately went to pilot, but didn't get picked up by the network. So I'm not as it was like, when I was young, I was just terrified of going to New York, and now I have a son and daughter-in-law and granddaughter who live there. So before COVID, I was there all the time, and that's the same thing with Hollywood. It doesn't scare me anymore. I understand what's different. I understand what's fun about it. But yeah, seeing 100 people working on something that was just this idea you were pushing around in your basement, it is mind-blowing. There's no way around it. What was really nice about The Burden of Proof is that it had the sort of the film that Mike Rowe made had the kind of smoky, deliberative air of the novel. And because you had more film time, it was less rushed. And there were two great performances at its core, the remarkable Hector Elizondo and my dear departed friend, Brian Dennehy, each of whom was just fantastic. And, it was both the filming of Presumed Innocent, where I was hanging around with Harrison Ford and Raul Julia and Brian. That's where I met Brian and where he became a friend for the rest of his life. That was very heady and kind of amazing. But being, The Burden of Proof, where I was a little less stage struck and able to be a little more of an aide and consultant to Mike Rowe, that was a very neat experience too.
I'm curious what made you want to pick back up with The Laws of Our Fathers at that point in your career.
I always felt, and still feel, by the way, that there hasn't been any narrative work that's fully done justice to what happened in the 1960s. And, I think the prevailing attitude is that it was an era of, great selfishness and nihilism, and but a huge number of really significant things happened in the 1960s. The Civil Rights Act was passed. The ongoing, everlasting movement for African American liberation really began to come to the fore then. The widespread acceptance of the idea that women were not being treated equally in this society and deserved to be, that really came to the fore in the 1960s. Attitudes towards sexuality and sex changed incredibly. And what I found when I tried to write about it is that it was almost like describing the cavemen. There had been such deep cultural changes caused in the 1960s that people really couldn't look back and believe that anybody had taken that stuff seriously. That people looked at Father Knows Best and didn't just laugh their sides off. With the idea of Jane Wyman at home and those goody kids, and this guy was mild-mannered, never even had a cocktail. So it was hard. It was hard because we now lived in the world that the 60s had created. But I was determined to try to do it. And I went back to it. Gigantic movie sale, gigantic. And my friend John Avnet bought, actually, spearheaded the drive and tried to turn it into a movie. Universal paid an outlandish amount of money. Went through one of those things that happens all the time in Hollywood, which is the leadership of the studio changed. And of course, when that happens, the first thing that the new people are going to say is, well, if this was such a good idea, why have I got this job? So ipso facto, it was idiotic to try to make a movie about the 60s, and it stopped cold. John, God bless him, has never really stopped trying. He still talks about making the laws of our fathers as a limited series on TV, and he is enough of a stubborn cuss that I wouldn't be shocked if he actually got it done. So, but we'll have to see.
Personal Injuries was ranked by Time magazine as the best fiction novel in 1999. Take us into a little bit of your narrative process, maybe using George Mason as an example.
Usually a book is told from the point of view of a major character. And either the character speaks in her or his own voice, or the character is talked about in the authorial third person. Joseph Conrad had used an outsider located in space and time, Marley, as the narrator of some of his books, even though Marley himself was not the main character. So that's where I had gotten the idea, but I didn't think, given the number of secrets that Robbie Favor has, the main character in Personal Injuries, I couldn't write from his point of view. And it didn't seem appropriate to write from a third person, because the third person author couldn't be taken in by Robbie in quite the same way that George, his lawyer, ultimately was. So I settled on that strategy, and it actually, I thought it worked really well in the book.
What do you most enjoy about the memorable supporting cast characters that have occurred throughout your catalog?
By the time I wrote Personal Injuries, I had then been practicing law for a while. And I went back to fictionalize the experiences I'd had as an assistant U.S. attorney in investigating corrupt judges. So, and along the way, particularly in that long-running investigation in which I had a role called Operation Greylord in Chicago, there were a lot of colorful characters. And, Robbie, the central character, was one, but as you point out, there are a lot of other people, Brendan Toohey, who really sort of epitomized the attitude toward corruption that persisted in certain quarters in Chicago. And it was like, I grasp this. I understand that human beings, by their nature, are evil. I know this. But most people are too weak to understand that. But I know that. I know that's the nature of humanity, and that God will forgive us in the end. And that was the life that Toohey lived. And I thought he was a very interesting figure. And, there were a lot. Stan, the sort of grasping, ambitious U.S. attorney, who's, gets in the middle of things and just can't contain himself. He has to win. He has to win. There's a lot of it. So it was a great book to write. I had a good time with it.
What first inspired the idea to write Reversible Errors with two sections, investigations and proceedings?
You can see the way I've sort of pirated my legal career in these novels. And when I sort of, was struck by lightning and, burden of proof after Presumed Innocent, I decided that I was going to make it my business to do a lot of legal work representing poor people for free. And that slowly led by various steps into dealing with the death penalty. And I wanted to write a novel about capital litigation and, everything that's involved, especially when good people have made a serious mistake in the way the legal system has operated. And that's what's at the heart of Reversible Errors. This very vulnerable, fairly goofy, somewhat disabled defendant, and a judge who, as it turns out, had a heroin habit at the time she sentenced him to death, and prosecutor and a cop, good people, but in some ways everybody's a prisoner of the system and needs to sort of pull themselves out of that morass of assumptions and look at everything anew. But that's what I wanted to write about in Reversible Errors.
When you brought Rusty and the gang back for Limitations and then Innocent, how would you wanted the characters to age after so much time between books?
Writing again from Rusty's voice, very easy, very natural. In retrospect, I like him a lot less than I did when I wrote Presumed Innocent. And, I think he forgives himself too many lapses. The guy who really rises above it all in Innocent is Tommy Malto, who's, was sort of a very nervous, agitated, angry Catholic kind of prosecutor, and then ends up marrying late in life, having a child. And his vistas in life, all this occurs after his mother dies, his vistas in life just expand hugely. And he becomes, I think, a much larger person as a result. And I just love that idea that people really can change for the better. And sometimes it happens. Sometimes people learn from their lives in a really good way. And Tommy has. So, so it's Rusty down, Tommy up. And I like the way the scales of justice swing there.
How do character names typically arrive to you? For instance, Bill Ten Broom in Testimony.
Ten Broom had to be, given the plot as I had conceived of it, he had to be Dutch, of Dutch ancestry. And the Ten Booms were relatively well-known figures in Holland of the Dutch wartime resistance. So Bill's last name is chosen in really homage to the Ten Booms, who were, as I said, great figures in the moral life of the Netherlands. In the book, again, I wanted to step outside of the legal world I knew, write about something I wanted to know about but didn't know much, which was the International Criminal Court in The Hague. I learned a lot in the course of that. And it also, frankly, gave me a vehicle to write a little bit about getting divorced and starting your life again. as Ten Boom says, whatever it is, the age of 55, I just started to start my life again. And, there was enough of that in my own life that wasn't important.
With Identical, how much fun was it to write the rivalry between the Cronin and Gianni families?
Yes. That's just, each novel is different. That one, though, is based on, the Greek myth of Castor and Pollux. And it's almost, what the Elizabethans called a conceit, in the sense that I'm always a great admirer of John Updike's The Centaur, in which he transformed a Greek myth into a present day tale. And so that inspired me to take a whack at it in Identical.
What did you most enjoy about getting up to work every morning on one of your most recent books, The Last Trial? And generally, what keeps it fresh for you as an author after so many years doing this?
The Last Trial, which is of shocking relevance in its subject matter right now, because it's about the clinical trial process, but it was made much more. In Innocent, which you mentioned, Sandy Stern, he had very serious lung cancer, but I didn't have the heart to kill him off because I love him so much. But while I was writing Testimony, Stern appears as a background character, and I started saying to myself, how in the hell could this guy who had metastatic non-small cell lung cancer, a really lethal disease, how can it be that it's 8 years later and he's still going? And I said, well, maybe there was some new therapy that came along. And that was the genesis for the idea that I would write about a crime supposedly committed in the course of the clinical trial process. And just to give it added piquancy, it was a drug that, while lethal in its side effects, and its undisclosed side effects for some people who take it, a drug that had nonetheless saved Sandy Stern's life. And so, I wanted to work on that irony. And in the course of it, Stern is representing an old friend who's a Nobel Prize winner in medicine. And the question that's grinding under the book all the way is, how do you measure the value of a life? And, as I was pushing towards 70 as that book was written, those were important questions to me. So, it's funny, Jake, I look back, I talk about these books, and the autobiographical anchor in each of them is relatively easy for me to acknowledge now with the distance of time. But as I was writing each of these books, I was much less cognizant of what I was actually working out for myself.
What gives you the greatest joy to know that you've inspired so many generations of readers and moviegoers alike to become both attorneys and authors?
It seems a little otherworldly, because an author's relationship with readers is very odd. As you are writing, you have in mind a kind of perfect reader, somebody out there who will understand every word in the way you intended it to be understood. Of course, that person's really you. But you want to believe there's somebody else just like you out there. But not anybody you know or in fact ever meet. On the other hand, the experience for the reader is one of great intimacy for the author. But my experience came years before, when I was writing. By the time you were, in my case, fortunately, millions of other people pick up my books, it's all in the past for me. And so people have this sense of, oh my God, you moved me so much. This was so important to me, which is gratifying. But that experience is no longer part of my life. So it's weird.
Can fans expect a new Sandy Stern novel soon?
The next book is about Sandy Stern's granddaughter, Pinky, who has sort of capitalized on the experience of the last trial and is now working as a private investigator in a law firm. And she is the same odd, impulsive creature that she was in the last trial. And there's a kind of sad undertone to that, because this is somebody coming to terms with the fact that she's strange and probably is never really going to fit well into the world. And but I'm having a good time writing it. It's a challenge to write a book from the point of view of somebody, not female. I've done that before, but 35 to 40 years younger. That's a challenge, but it's also what makes it so interesting.
We've really enjoyed this conversation, and I thank you so much again. If we could just close with a few gems of wisdom for those fans of yours that might want to follow in your footsteps into the book business, that'd be wonderful.
I will tell you what I tell everybody
Please.
is, and it's sort of the corollary of Stegner saying you got to put your butt in the chair. Writers write. If you want to be a writer, then you have to write. And hanging around with writers or dreaming about the book that you'll someday get on paper, that is not writing. Sitting down, going through that struggle of connecting thoughts and feelings with words, that's writing. And if you do it, you're a writer, and if you don't, you're not. So
boom. I'll keep you in the loop on the editing and everything for the final episode to look at it. Thank you so very much for your time. Your books have meant a lot to so many people. I appreciate you being part of this.
Thank you so much for the obvious, careful and really thoughtful preparation that you did.
Oh, well, thank you.
It's a joy for an author to have talked to somebody who's spent as much time thinking about what he's going to ask and what you've done as a writer.
Mr. Turow, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much again for being on About the Authors TV.
Thank you so much.